Archaeological teams that later surveyed the ruins and archival deposits associated with the Interex recovered fragments of technologies that did not fit comfortably into the established taxonomies of the Imperium's Adeptus Mechanicus. Field reports list altered power cells stamped with manufacturing sigils unlike any recorded Adeptus Mechanicus pattern, capacitors embedded with non-standard crystal lattices, and the remains of compact propulsion actuators whose engineering suggested emphasis on agility and redundancy rather than raw defensive mass. Eyewitness reports from survivors and from members of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet describe urban districts where statues, public works, and what were called halls of devices stood adjacent to markets and laboratories. Those same reports emphasize the presence of automated servitors and drones operating with degrees of autonomy that alarmed Mechanicum attachees. The testimony of Imperial negotiators and later transcribed logbooks record conversations in which Interex delegates referred to corrupting forces by a single term rendered in Imperial common as chaos, and where Kinnebrak envoys were treated as regular participants in civic councils. These combined archaeological and eyewitness records form the earliest corpus used by later scholars to reconstruct the polity now discussed as the Interex. The earliest canonical references place the Interex in the era commonly called the Great Crusade in Millennia 31. Contemporary sources describe them as a human interstellar civilization whose polity structure differed from the militarized and theocratic model later imposed by the Imperium of Man, where the Imperium organized planets and systems around compliance and martial governance. The Interex are uniformly described in surviving texts as pursuing a program of interspecies cooperation and integration. This foundational choice shaped their diplomatic priorities and their defensive postures. Rather than build standing armies keyed exclusively to conquest, Interex states seem to have invested in defensive technologies and social systems intended to reduce armed conflict while integrating alien polities into a shared civic framework. Scholars have noted that this philosophical orientation, coexistence rather than extermination, was not mere idealism but a deliberate civilizational strategy that shaped trade law, education, and military doctrine. Estimating the scale of Interex settlement and population requires treating the surviving secondary accounts with care. The commonly cited figure in some compendia places the Interex sphere across roughly 30 star systems. Other, later or more speculative compilations expand that figure to several hundred worlds or to a cluster of colonized systems numbering in the low hundreds. These discrepancies arise from narrative compression in early accounts and from the fragmentary survival of Interex administrative records. For practical reconstruction, accepted summaries in major reference works converge on an interstellar polity that was significant but not galactic in reach. Large enough to maintain standing fleets, interstellar trade, and institutional archives, yet structured in a way that favoured distributed autonomy among member worlds rather than centralised planetary inventories. Where numerical precision is demanded, the conservative reading of primary summaries treats the 30 star systems figure as a documented baseline, while acknowledging that some secondary sources have argued for a considerably larger web of affiliated worlds. Physical anthropology ascribed to Interex populations is thin in the primary narrative record. The most consistent detail repeated across reliable compendia is that Interex were physical humans with a single noted morphological divergence, pronounced auricular development, described in several entries as elongated bat-like ears. The feature is tied in the same sources to a characteristic mode of vocalization and a cultural idiom that incorporated musical modulations as part of formal speech. That combination, structural auricular distinction coupled with an evolved dialect, has led field linguists to hypothesize a communicative system where tonal modulation and resonance were integral to ceremonial and technical registers. Where modern syntheses attempt to quantify height and mass, they do so from a small set of eyewitness descriptions and artistic renderings. These reconstructions generally characterize Interex adults as taller than the Imperial human average, and of proportions that would place many individuals in a range approximating 1 meter, 8 centimeters to 2 meters in height, with corresponding mass estimates that scale to those statures. These physical estimates are explicitly reconstructive and should be read as scholarly approximations rather than direct canonical measurements. The Interex social fabric as recorded by contemporary observers shows a polity in which aliens and humans shared civic spaces and institutions. Most prominently recorded among their allies were the Kinnebrach, a simian species integrated into Interex society as scientists, scholars, and combat forces. Observers consistently emphasize that Kinnebrach were not treated as subaltern auxiliaries, but as participants in governance and research. They occupied roles ranging from laboratory technicians to frontline shock troops. This integration of Xenos elements into civil and military life is repeatedly cited in the surviving diplomatic correspondence that the Imperium later captured. Where the Imperium regarded Xenos as threats to be quarantined, Interex records indicate legal frameworks for interspecies treaties, property rights for non-human citizens, and shared defense pacts. The analytical consequence of this social model was that Interex recruitment was plural in its composition. Human ranks were complemented by Xenos bodies and by automated systems, and military formations reflected this hybridized order, rather than an exclusive reliance upon human soldiery. Descriptions of Interex military organization emphasize modularity and platform integration, rather than the orthodox combined arms doctrine known to Imperial strategists. Eyewitness accounts from the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet describe Interex warriors operating from mobile fighting platforms that altered the silhouette of an individual combatant. An operator would enter or interface with a platform and, from the point of view of an observer unaccustomed to the design, produce the visual impression of a centaur-like figure. Early Imperial tentatives to categorize these platforms used terms that revealed more about the cataloger than the device. Some records called them warframes, others used mechanical metaphors. Tactical reports note that the platforms increased a single warrior's mobility and technical connectivity to swarm drones and remote munitions. These fighting platforms, together with a family of light, high-energy projectile weapons and energy bow constructs, allowed Interex formations to engage Space Marine contingents on relatively equal terms in close urban environments. That parity in initial engagements was one of the facts that most surprised Imperial officers and that later entered the historiography of the Great Crusade. The weapons suite recorded in Imperial after-action and museum records is notable, both for its variety and for certain unique specimens. The Kinnebrach produced artifacts, most famously a blade-type instrument known in surviving sources as an anathem. Compendia describe the anathem as a rare and sophisticated weapon, whose properties bordered on the arcane, and later histories link it to events with far-reaching consequence. Interex projectile implements combined conventional metallurgy and focused energy projection. A type of longbow or crossbow, dismissed by some Imperial observers at first as ceremonial, was later demonstrated in combat to emit coherent energy bolts with the capacity to penetrate environment armor and to damage power armor in sustained bursts. Automated drones and quasi-autonomous systems formed the third pillar of Interex force projection. Rather than the servitor-based labor of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Interex maintenance protocols allowed for more fully autonomous drone operation in civilian and military spaces. These differences in tool use and doctrine created friction with Mechanicus attaches and with Imperial logisticians, who interpreted the autonomy of Interex devices as a doctrinal hazard rather than a civilizational choice. The engineering and design ethos of Interex vehicles and tools favored redundancy and modular repairability. Hull and frame designs routinely exposed service points and maintenance channels that permitted in-field cannibalization or rapid part replacement. Logs taken from captured devices and fragments show a systems-level preference for distributed control nodes over single, central command cores. Analysts have argued that this distributed approach made Interex systems resilient in environments where centralized control could be compromised. That design decision also manifested in the cultural acceptance of partially autonomous assistants, mechanical entities and drones that performed logistical, administrative, and even some judicial functions. Some observers, particularly those attached to the Adeptus Mechanicus, recorded these practices with suspicion, noting perceived parallels to the banned and traumatic histories of artificial intelligences in the dark age of technology. In reaction, Mechanicum engineers insisted on a program of reclassification and, where possible, remediation of captured Interex systems. Recruitment and training for Interex military cadres appear in surviving diplomatic and military notes as lengthy, civic processes that intertwined education, civic service, and martial apprenticeship, where Imperial recruitment often prioritized genetic selection and augmentation as early determinants of military role. Interex recruitment narratives stress versatility and cross-disciplinary competence. Warriors were not only trained in marksmanship or platform operation, they were schooled in negotiation, integrative science, and cultural liaison tasks intended to enable them to act as first responders in interspecies incidents. This hybrid training model explains the presence of field officers able to act concurrently as combat commanders and as diplomatic interlocutors, an attribute several Imperial officers later identified with both admiration and wariness during initial contact operations. The Interex archival habit left a patchwork of institutional records, municipal ledgers, treaty codices, and preserved museum catalogues that are often cited by historians trying to reconstruct administrative structures. Surviving entries on museum inventories, now extant in fragmentary copies in Imperial repositories, mention the Hall of Devices as a public institution on the world Zenobia. That institution housed several Kennebrack artifacts and Xenos weaponry, and it is from that hall that a critical theft was later recorded in Imperial narrative. A blade of Kennebrack origin, associated with contaminating influences, and later identified as an instrument that played a role in the chain of events culminating in the War Master Horus's injury and subsequent treatments. The theft and the explosion of part of the hall are recorded in multiple accounts and function as a pivot in the narrative of early contact between the Interex and the Lunar Wolves. These events are central to any archaeological interpretation of the collapse of Interex diplomatic engagement with the Imperium. Technology transfer, trade, and hybridized production networks bound Interex worlds to their Xenos partners. Engineering manuals recovered by Imperial forces contain schematics showing composite alloys and manufacture procedures that reference Kennebrack input. The implication is clear in surviving correspondence. Interex industry routinely incorporated alien materials science into human fabrication lines. That cross-species technological synthesis allowed Interex armaments to achieve high energy efficiency and compact power density in ways that surprised later Imperial analysts. The existence of such synthesis also helps explain why Interex society was both technologically advanced and culturally pluralistic. Technical competence and social integration were reciprocally reinforcing elements of their civilization. In assessing the early purpose of the Interex as a polity, historians converge on a modest formulation. They were a human civilization that deliberately pursued an alternative to the expansionist and homogenizing tendencies that characterized many galactic powers of the era. Their policy of integration with certain alien races, most notably the Kennebrack, functioned both as a moral stance and as a strategic calculation designed to reduce the probability of interspecies war within their sphere. The archaeological and eyewitness residues of their world systems, museums, technical archives, and civic infrastructures support the interpretation of the Interex as a civilization oriented toward preservation, shared knowledge, and technological exchange. That orientation, however, placed them in acute contrast to the Imperium's priorities and set the stage for the diplomatic tensions that followed contact in Millennia 31. The surviving corpus that informs these reconstructions is limited and often refracted through the interpretive frames of Imperial chroniclers. That fact demands caution. Much of what can be said with confidence concerns the Interex's choices and public institutions rather than fine-grained demographic statistics. Where numbers or precise biometric averages are required, the most responsible course is to present ranges and to mark them as inferential. Where behavioral tendencies are asserted, an emphasis on diplomacy, an openness to Xenos participation, and a technological penchant for distributed and autonomous systems. These claims rest on multiple converging sources and on the preserved fragments of Interex engineering and civic records. The material remains, read alongside eyewitness testimony from the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet and associated attaché reports, form the evidentiary backbone for subsequent chapters that will trace the operational consequences of these civilizational choices. The fragmentary records left by the Interex reveal a civilization that combined technological sophistication with a deeply structured civic order. Civilian and military life were not regarded as entirely separate domains, but rather as complementary roles within a society that considered defense, knowledge, and cultural preservation as communal responsibilities. Surviving references from expeditionary logbooks repeatedly describe the population as disciplined, orderly, and oriented toward collective stability. This communal orientation manifested in both their urban planning and in the integration of cultural rituals into daily life. When Imperial observers first entered Interex-controlled cities, they noted the deliberate symmetry of civic architecture, public meeting places designed not only for commerce, but also for communal education, and the visible presence of museums and archival spaces as central institutions rather than marginal ones. These design choices illustrate that Interex priorities were not simply martial survival, but also the cultivation of historical memory and technological stewardship. Civilian roles in Interex society were strongly defined by educational paths. Children were not immediately assigned into rigid vocations, but were instead subject to a broad curriculum that included scientific instruction, cultural traditions, and martial preparedness. Surviving accounts mention that even non-combatants possessed a functional familiarity with weapons and defense systems. This is consistent with the Interex philosophy that every citizen should be able to contribute to the survival of the polity if required. Civilian life was nevertheless not militarized in the same way as Imperial hive worlds or frontier colonies. Rather, education emphasized versatility. Individuals trained in arts, administration, and scientific research were also expected to understand the rudiments of combat, survival, and interspecies negotiation. The model thus produced a society where the boundary between soldier and civilian was deliberately porous, with readiness and cultural literacy regarded as twin obligations of citizenship. The military structure drew heavily from this broader civic model. Recruitment did not begin with genetic enhancement or conscription, but with selection from the civilian population after years of general education. Those with physical aptitude, intellectual ability, and ethical reliability were inducted into specialized warrior cadres. The distinction between civilian and military within the Interex was therefore more a matter of emphasis than of absolute division. Warriors were expected to remain part of the civic fabric, returning to civilian institutions between deployments, serving as instructors, or participating in cultural and ritual life. This fluidity between roles contrasts sharply with the Imperial practice of isolating military orders, particularly Space Marines, from the populations they defended. To the Interex, the soldier was not a separate caste, but rather a citizen fulfilling a civic function in rotation with others. Lifestyle patterns among the Interex suggest a population that valued cultural participation as highly as martial preparation. Imperial records remark on the prominence of music, public performance, and communal rituals. The distinctive elongated ears of the Interex are consistently linked with their musical culture, which relied on tonal communication and resonant instruments. Accounts from Imperial negotiators describe entire assemblies where speeches were delivered in a cadence closer to song than to simple spoken language. This was not theatrical ornamentation, but an embedded cultural practice, one that reinforced collective memory and transmitted civic ethics. Civilian and military alike took part in these rituals, which were as much about affirming unity as they were about transmitting doctrine. The ethical system that emerges from reconstructed documents can be described as both pragmatic and ritualized. On the pragmatic side, Interex ethics were shaped by the constant awareness of external threats, particularly the danger of chaos, which they referred to directly as chaos. They treated the subject not with superstition, but with institutionalized vigilance. Every citizen was educated from youth to recognize signs of chaos corruption, and museum archives served not merely as cultural repositories, but also as cautionary spaces, housing examples of corrupted artifacts and weapons as instructive warnings. On the ritualized side, this vigilance was reinforced through ceremonies where artifacts were exhibited and histories retold, embedding the lesson of vigilance into communal identity. Ethics thus blended moral caution with civic responsibility to safeguard the community, to resist corruption, and to uphold the collective order. Internal castes or divisions within Interex society are less well documented but can be inferred. At minimum, records indicate a tripartite arrangement between civilians, warriors, and scholars. Civilians formed the broad foundation, engaging in agriculture, manufacture, trade, and the arts. Warriors, though drawn from the same population, constituted an identifiable martial cadre with access to specialized platforms and weaponry. Scholars, including human and Kinabrak alike, held significant prestige and were integrated directly into governance. The fact that Kinabrak scientists and scholars are mentioned repeatedly in Interex records indicates that the scholar class may have been one of the most open and pluralistic of all, functioning as a unifying bridge between human and non-human members of society. These divisions, however, were not rigid castes in the hereditary sense, but roles into which individuals could transition depending on ability, education, and civic need. Leadership in the Interex followed this integrative pattern. Contemporary imperial reports refer to councils rather than monarchs or singular rulers. These councils included human and Kinabrak representatives, suggesting a shared leadership model that valued distributed authority. It is likely that such councils were responsible not only for policy, but also for maintaining vigilance against chaos. Their political legitimacy seems to have rested not on hereditary right, but on demonstrated knowledge and civic trust. Councils were reported to include scholars, diplomats, and warriors, each providing different perspectives on governance. This again underscores the Interex emphasis on integration rather than separation. Leadership was conceived as a balanced assembly rather than a command hierarchy imposed from above. Ritual life appears to have been especially important in maintaining cohesion across a multi-species society. The Interex emphasis on music and tone as communicative modes meant that ritual ceremonies often combined speech, song, and instrumentation. Visitors from the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet recorded that audiences were not passive spectators, but participants, joining in responses or harmonies. These ceremonies functioned as cultural glue, binding humans and Kinabrak into a single polity by means of shared cultural performance. Beyond festivals and public ceremonies, ritual also permeated the military. Pre-battle preparations reportedly involved chants or tonal sequences designed to synchronize both human warriors and their Kinabrak allies. Such rituals provided both psychological preparation and practical communication, leveraging the unique auditory capacities of the Interex. The values of the Interex can be summarized as preservation, vigilance, and integration. Preservation was embodied in their museums and archives, institutions treated not as elite spaces but as civic responsibilities. Vigilance was institutionalized in their ethical system, teaching citizens to resist chaos and to safeguard the polity through discipline and awareness. Integration was their defining political value, the decision to include alien species as partners rather than as enemies. Taken together, these values shaped a civilization distinct from the Imperium, less expansionist, less authoritarian, and more pluralistic, but also more vulnerable to betrayal and internal compromise, as the later collapse of their relationship with the Imperium demonstrates. In sum, Interex civilian and military life was characterized by fluid roles, broad education, and deep integration of culture with defense. Rituals reinforced ethics, ethics reinforced vigilance, and vigilance underpinned social structure. Their leadership reflected their values, organized around councils and shared responsibility rather than singular rule. While fragmentary, the surviving accounts of their lifestyle and ethics present a coherent picture of a civilization that stood apart from imperial orthodoxy, a society ordered around memory, caution, and cooperation. It is this unique order that would both sustain them against external corruption and ultimately place them in irreconcilable opposition to the Imperium's own vision of human destiny. The records of the Interex are sparse, and much of what is known about their notable figures and military institutions is derived second-hand, preserved in the fragmented testimonies of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet and the surviving descriptions of captured archives. Unlike the Imperium, which placed emphasis on centralized heroic leadership and hagiographic accounts of its commanders, the Interex do not appear to have elevated individual leaders to mythic status in their own record-keeping. Their social model favoured councils, assemblies, and distributed authority, and it is therefore unsurprising that very few singular names are preserved in history. Nevertheless, a handful of leaders appear in imperial records, either because they interacted directly with imperial delegations, or because they played key roles in the brief but consequential conflict that ensued. Among these, the most frequently cited is a commander referred to in imperial records as Nasurai. This figure is presented in surviving sources as a high-ranking Interex official who acted as both a military leader and a representative during initial negotiations with the Lunar Wolves. Nasurai's prominence in the surviving accounts may derive from his role as both a statesman and a general, a dual function consistent with Interex traditions of integrating civilian and martial responsibilities. Reports suggest that Nasurai was instrumental in articulating the Interex view of chaos to the Imperial delegation, warning them of the dangers of exposure to corrupted artifacts and explaining the vigilance measures that governed Interex policy. The fact that his name is preserved in Imperial records at all suggests that he was either a recognized leader across multiple systems or a spokesperson selected by the Interex Council to address the Imperium. His presence demonstrates the Interex reliance on leaders who could embody both martial readiness and intellectual authority. Other leaders are mentioned only in fragments, often without names. Surviving notes from Imperial attachés describe archons or councillors who presided over assemblies that included both human and Kinabrak representatives. These figures were less military commanders than civic leaders who could nonetheless mobilize defense forces when required. The integration of the Kinabrak into governance means that famous leaders of the Interex cannot be described solely in human terms. Kinabrak scholars and generals would have sat alongside human counterparts in positions of authority. The absence of individual names in the sources is less a deficiency of record and more an indicator of the Interex cultural bias toward collective leadership. Unlike the Imperium, where generals and primarchs dominated historical record, the Interex placed institutional continuity above individual glorification. Military units within the Interex displayed the same hybridized quality as their leadership. The most distinctive formations were those that combined human warriors with Kinabrak troops, integrated into cohesive fighting forces. Imperial reports emphasize that Kinabrak soldiers were formidable, described as larger and stronger than human counterparts, and often deployed as shock infantry. Their presence within Interex armies served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, they provided close combat strength to complement human agility and ranged weaponry. Symbolically, they demonstrated the Interex commitment to interspecies integration, presenting a unified front of human and non-human fighters against external threats. In addition to mixed infantry, the Interex maintained a unique category of warriors equipped with the distinctive fighting platforms described by Imperial observers as producing the silhouette of centaur-like figures. These war platforms functioned as exoskeletal mounts, integrating the operator into a mobile weapon system that enhanced speed, endurance, and connectivity with drone support networks. The resulting combatants were described as swift, versatile, and capable of executing complex tactical maneuvers in synchrony with swarm drones. While the Imperium often categorized its military units along clear lines, infantry, cavalry, armor, the Interex blurred these categories, creating formations that combine the advantages of multiple types in a single integrated unit. The centaur-like appearance of these warriors, noted repeatedly in eyewitness testimony, is one of the most enduring visual markers of Interex military identity. The war machines of the Interex are remembered not only for their unusual designs, but also for their underlying philosophy. Whereas Imperial armour relied on heavy plating, singular command structures, and brute force, Interex vehicles and drones emphasized agility, modular repairability, and distributed control. Light skimmers, drone swarms, and semi-autonomous artillery are all mentioned in the fragmented descriptions. These machines were not designed to dominate through overwhelming firepower, but to operate in concert with infantry and platforms, creating a flexible, adaptive force that could respond to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Some Imperial accounts describe being overwhelmed not by the raw strength of Interex war machines, but by their coordination. Drones disrupting supply lines, skimmers striking from unexpected angles, and infantry platform hybrids executing rapid flanking maneuvers. The most infamous weapon associated with the Interex, however, is not a war machine but an artifact, the anatheum. Preserved in the Hall of Devices on the world Zenobia, this blade was of Kinebrak origin and is described as possessing corruptive properties that connected it to the powers of chaos. The anatheum's theft by Imperial agents and the resulting confrontation marked the collapse of relations between the Interex and the Imperium. While the weapon itself was alien in origin, its presence in Interex custody demonstrates both their vigilance and their peril. They preserved such artifacts not to use them, but to study them, to maintain awareness of the dangers posed by chaos. That one such artifact became a catalyst for catastrophic events beyond their control underscores the precariousness of their position. Beyond specific leaders, units, and machines, the behavioral instincts and tendencies of the Interex as a civilization can be reconstructed from the pattern of their choices. First, among these tendencies was caution. Their entire system of vigilance against chaos, their emphasis on education, and their preservation of dangerous artifacts in controlled environments reflect an instinctive wariness. Unlike the Imperium, which often approached the unknown with aggression, the Interex approached it with containment and study. This behavioral instinct is consistent across their political, military, and cultural practices. Second was integration. The Interex instinctively sought to incorporate rather than exclude, to create unity out of diversity. This is evident in their inclusion of the Kinebrak as full participants in society, in their use of mixed formations in military units, and in their councils that included multiple voices. Their behavior reveals an underlying assumption that stability could be maintained not by suppressing difference, but by harmonizing it into a larger whole. Third was a tendency toward discipline. Imperial observers noted the ordered nature of their cities, the structured nature of their rituals, and the disciplined coordination of their armies. This was not the discipline of authoritarian command, but the discipline of collective consensus. Their behavioral instinct was not to follow a single leader blindly, but to align as a group through ritual, training, and education. This created armies that could move with unity and civilians that could act with shared purpose without relying on fear or coercion. In combat, these behavioral tendencies manifested in distinctive ways. Interex warriors did not charge recklessly but advanced in coordinated patterns, making full use of drone support and war platform mobility. They fought with precision rather than brute force, attempting to control the rhythm of battle through speed, coordination, and technological adaptability. This contrasted sharply with the more direct, overwhelming assaults of Imperial forces, leading some Imperial officers to remark that Interex tactics were as alien in spirit as they were in form. Yet these same tendencies also carried limitations. Their caution, while protective, could lead to hesitation in the face of sudden aggression. Their integration, while admirable, created vulnerabilities when trust was betrayed, as it was during the theft of the anathem. Their discipline, while effective in ordered conditions, was less suited to the chaotic unpredictability of an Imperium that often embraced shock and terror as weapons of war. In this sense, their behavioral instincts were both their greatest strengths and their eventual weaknesses. In conclusion, the Interex produced leaders who embodied both martial and intellectual authority, maintained military units that blended human, alien, and mechanical elements, and fielded war machines designed for adaptability rather than domination. Their behavioral instincts emphasized caution, integration, and discipline, creating a society both distinct from and irreconcilable with the Imperium of Man. The fragments that remain, names like Nasure, the image of centaur-like warriors, the memory of the anatheme, are all that survive of a civilization whose choices set it on a path of brief but fateful collision with the Great Crusade. The fragmented records that survived the destruction of the Interex have long drawn the attention of both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Each institution approached the matter differently. The Administratum with an eye to imperial cataloguing, precedent, and historical judgment. The Mechanicus with a deep hunger for technical data, reverse engineering, and the pursuit of archaeotech knowledge. Neither was able to recover a complete picture of the Interex, yet both have produced compiled reports, many of which were eventually sealed or consigned to restricted archives. From the standpoint of the Administratum, the Interex was an anomaly within the broad history of the Great Crusade. The early imperial expeditions that encountered them recorded a population structure unlike that of most rediscovered human civilizations, whereas most human domains brought into compliance either mirrored the barbarism of Old Night, the theocratic rigidity of scattered empires, or the fractured instability of feral states. The Interex presented themselves as orderly, literate, and highly stable. Administratum comparators, based on census projections from other compliance records, estimated the Interex population at approximately several tens of billions, distributed across multiple core worlds. Precise numbers were impossible to determine, but the ratio of urban density to agricultural spread suggested that no single Interex world exceeded the population magnitude of Terra, though collectively they formed a significant polity. The Administratum took particular note of the way the Interex maintained a balance between their civilian and military sectors. Surviving records indicate that they operated under a mixed governance that blurred distinctions between soldier, scholar, and administrator. Administratum analysts, used to clearer hierarchies, struggled to categorize their leadership. No High Lord, no primarchal figure, and no singular dynasty appeared to control their society. Instead, leadership was diffused into councils, wherein military commanders, philosophers, and civic officials shared authority. This was annotated in comparison logs as a collective oligarchy, though it did not match any common Terran precedents. The Mechanicus viewed the same data differently. For the tech priests, the absence of a central authority was not the most pressing detail. What consumed their attention was the presence of technologies that combined weaponry, culture, and biology in unusual ways. The Kinnebrak artifact recovered during the disastrous Imperial Interex negotiations was categorized as a Xenos-derived weapon of extreme potential, a form of compact destructive technology that defied contemporary human classification. The Interex had stored such devices within secure repositories, using them not for conquest but for containment. From the Mechanicus perspective, this implied a society that prioritized stability over expansion. Such restraint was alien to the logic of both the Mechanicus and the Crusade, where discovery was synonymous with exploitation. Administratum logistics officers were equally perplexed by the Interex supply systems. Reports from the early Lunar Wolves expedition noted the efficient deployment of troops, but not in numbers that would overwhelm by sheer weight. Instead, the Interex emphasized precision. Where the Imperium relied on mass-produced lass rifles, armor columns, and orbital dominance, the Interex forces were noted for composite weapon systems that combined melee and ranged elements, such as plasma bows, charged spears, and atham swords alongside disciplined tactical formations. Supply chains were shorter, less wasteful, and more adaptive. In post-engagement reconstructions, Administratum clerks estimated that an Interex battle group consumed less than half the logistical footprint of a comparable Imperial expeditionary force, yet maintained a combat efficiency that, in their words, outstripped expectation given numeric disparity. This observation led to one of the enduring points of discussion between the two institutions. The administratum concluded that the Interex society had developed a doctrine of measured warfare, one that relied on conservation of life and resources, aligning with their broader societal values of balance. The Mechanicus, however, concluded that such efficiency was impossible without advanced technological integration, much of it likely drawn from Kylo design. They hypothesized that the Interex's ability to maintain low resource consumption in war was a direct result of Xenos symbiosis, a finding that was politically sensitive, since it challenged the Imperium's foundational dogma of human supremacy. Further contradictions emerged in the area of record keeping. The administratum was fascinated by the Interex's music-based archive system. Though fragmentary, the description suggests that the Interex stored historical, legal and scientific data through structured harmonic encoding. Imperial linguists recorded that Interex officials could interpret layered meaning through tonal sequences, essentially reading archives through auditory performance. The administratum catalogued this as evidence of cultural eccentricity, but Mechanicus lex mechanics argued that such systems hinted at data storage compression far superior to parchment, cogitation, or simple vox recording. If true, the Interex had devised an information medium that merged art and science, which in Mechanicus analysis was a dangerous but remarkable fusion. In their final assessments, administratum scribes attempted to classify the Interex along the standard compliance scales. Militarily, they were rated as intermediate threat. Culturally, they were recorded as Xenos sympathetic. Politically, they were noted as non-expansionist. The combination was rare, for most civilizations encountered were either expansionist threats, stagnant relics, or collapsed ruins. The Interex did not fit any of these molds. The administratum records that survive indicate a tone of unease. While not an enemy by instinct, the Interex could not be trusted to conform to the strictures of Imperial unity. Mechanicus evaluations were sharper. Surviving tech analyses focus almost exclusively on the Kenebrak element. The Interex relationship with these Xenos was recorded as one of cautious coexistence, perhaps even alliance. Mechanicus categorization placed this within the highest degrees of tech heresy. A polity that had not only tolerated alien influence but integrated their technology was seen as irredeemably tainted. The fact that their weapons and artifacts could not be replicated or fully understood by the Mechanicus only deepened this conclusion. The Interex, in Mechanicus analysis, represented both a lost opportunity and a contamination. In logistical terms, both administratum and Mechanicus reports converged on one detail. The Interex were organized in ways that minimized waste. Their agricultural systems, though not deeply documented, were thought to be highly productive. Their urban planning distributed population without overcrowding. Energy consumption rates, deduced from reconnaissance of city-scale lighting and industry, appeared sustainable. Where the Imperium operated on extractive conquest, strip mining and overpopulation, the Interex appeared to manage equilibrium. This detail is repeated across multiple documents as a distinguishing feature, perhaps the most alien trait of all when viewed through Imperial lenses. Some administratum assessments speculate that this equilibrium was precisely why the Interex were destroyed. A society that valued balance and restraint was unlikely to submit to the all-consuming demands of Imperial compliance. Their logistical methods, while efficient, were not aligned with the exponential requirements of Imperial warfare. To the Crusade, every discovered civilization was either a tributary resource or an enemy to be broken. The Interex could be neither, and thus became the latter. The Mechanicus perspective added a final layer of condemnation. Their archivists noted that the Interex maintained restricted vaults, repositories where dangerous technologies, particularly Kenebrak weapons, were secured. For the Mechanicus, the idea that such artifacts would be locked away rather than sanctified, studied and replicated was an inversion of the machine cult's creed. It suggested that the Interex believed some knowledge should be controlled, even hidden. This was intolerable to Mechanicus dogma, which equated knowledge with divine pursuit. Thus, their reports consistently frame the Interex as heretical, not only for Xenos integration, but for their denial of the sanctity of unrestricted technological exploration. When combined, the Administratum and Mechanicus impressions portray the Interex as both anomaly and threat, not by sheer numbers nor by military conquest, but by the suggestion of an alternative human path, one built on measured resource use, cultural technical synthesis, and coexistence with alien knowledge. To the Imperium, such an example was intolerable, for it revealed that humanity might have survived the long night without Terra's central dominance, without the Emperor's enforced unity. Whether by design or by misunderstanding, the Imperium chose eradication, and the Administratum files closed their entries with the phrase, "Compliance incomplete, record terminated." The Mechanicus files meanwhile conclude with sealed annotations, much of them redacted. Thus the combined impressions do not simply describe the Interex as a civilization, they reveal as much about the Imperium itself, an empire unwilling to accept variation, intolerant of alternate forms of human progress, and compelled to interpret harmony as heresy. The record of Interex warfare is limited not by the absence of conflict, but by the scarcity of sources that survived their destruction. The Imperium's archives provide only partial accounts, most derived from the early diplomatic contacts of the Lunar Wolves and the catastrophic engagement that followed. Much of what is known about their broader military history has been pieced together through cross-reference, fragmentary Mechanicus transcripts, and comparative analysis of surviving weapon designs. Within these constraints, several points of clarity can be extracted. The Interex were not pacifists. Though their culture emphasized balance and restraint, their existence alongside the Kinabrak demanded the maintenance of a strong martial tradition. Administratum records note that the Interex were engaged in a long-term cold conflict with the Kinabrak species, a relationship characterized by limited warfare and containment. This was not war in the imperial sense, where extermination or absorption were the only outcomes. Rather, the Interex developed a doctrine of border defense, using both diplomacy and measured violence to restrict Kinabrak expansion. Their society invested considerable resources in military training, and the weapons recovered from their arsenals display craftsmanship equal to or beyond that of the early Great Crusade era Imperium. Imperial tacticians analysing the First Contact noted the distinctive features of Interex battle doctrine. Their formations emphasized speed, maneuverability, and precision strikes. Where Imperial strategy often relied on shock and mass assault, the Interex approached engagements with the intent to limit bloodshed while ensuring effectiveness. Their soldiers carried composite weaponry, often described in records as stringed arms or bow weapons, devices capable of both long-range projection and close-range lethality. Administratum notes compare them to archaeotech versions of archaic Terran bows, though enhanced through unknown technological means to deliver kinetic or energy-based projectiles of formidable power. In terms of battlefield organization, the Interex favored modular units. A typical cohort was comprised of infantry supported by mobile war machines, yet the scale of these machines was significantly smaller than Imperial equivalents. Where the Imperium deployed Baneblades, Predators, or massed artillery, the Interex utilized lighter, multi-purpose constructs capable of operating independently for extended durations. Mechanicus observers speculated that these machines were hybridized with alien technology, given their unusual energy signatures and adaptability. They were neither crude servitors nor fully autonomous machines, but integrated systems that blended organic precision with mechanical resilience. The most famous recorded engagement between the Interex and the Imperium occurred during the fateful compliance attempt led by the Lunar Wolves in Millennia 30. This conflict, triggered by the theft of a Kinabrak artifact from the Interex's vaults, provides the clearest picture of their fighting style. Administratum after-action reports describe the Interex response as immediate, disciplined, and overwhelming in precision. Interex forces deployed in dense urban environments with full knowledge of terrain advantage. They avoided open-field confrontation against the massed Imperial infantry, instead using mobility to strike at command nodes, supply lines, and isolated detachments. This doctrine aligned more closely with asymmetrical containment strategies than full-scale warfare, suggesting that their intent was to disable Imperial capacity rather than annihilate outright. Eyewitness accounts from Imperial officers describe Interex combatants as unnervingly calm in battle. They did not advance with chants or displays of aggression. Instead, they moved with practiced synchronization, each fighter operating as though part of a greater pattern. This has led some Mechanicus analysts to speculate that the Interex integrated tactical coordination into their training at a near-instinctive level, possibly aided by communication systems embedded into their gear. Their formations adapted dynamically to threats, closing when Imperial bolter fire was dispersed and scattering when heavy artillery attempted to concentrate. Administratum casualty projections from the Lunar Wolves skirmishes record losses higher than expected for an initial compliance action. Exact numbers are obscured, but reconstructed estimates suggest that in the first 48 hours of hostilities, Imperial casualties reached several thousand, far exceeding baseline expectations for a mid-strength human civilization. The discrepancy was attributed not to overwhelming numbers, but to the precise lethality of Interex weapons. Their projectiles were described as capable of piercing ceramite armor, also often against fully powered Astartes plate. Standard Imperial infantry, however, were highly vulnerable, and whole companies of auxilia were reported as annihilated within minutes of contact. The fighting style of the Interex demonstrated another unusual trait, an aversion to unnecessary destruction. Records note that their war machines avoided firing into civilian structures and instead confined their operations to strictly military targets. Even when Imperial bombardment damaged sections of Interex cities, their counterstrikes remained limited, aimed to disable rather than level urban sectors. This was noted with surprise by administratum observers, for it diverged from the common practice of most human polities of the era, which often fought with little regard for civilian survival. The Interex approach suggested a deliberate ethic of conservation, extending even into warfare. Mechanicus archives offer a more technical perspective. Their reports detail that Interex weaponry operated on a principle not fully understood by Imperial science. Descriptions liken them to sonic resonance or harmonic discharge devices. Infantry weapons emitted tonal frequencies during operation, recorded by vox logs as musical notes at the moment of discharge. Whether these were simply byproducts or integral to their function remains uncertain. Tech priests examining recovered fragments after the conflict were unable to replicate or reverse engineer the systems, leading to the conclusion that the Interex possessed a knowledge base beyond current Mechanicus schema. Another dimension of their combat effectiveness lay in their war machines. Though only fragmentary, descriptions of Interex constructs depict quadrupedal or multi-limbed machines armed with ranged and melee capabilities. These machines displayed agility uncommon in Mechanicus pattern engines. Their movements were likened more to predators than to the grinding advance of Imperial armor. Reports claim they could leap or scale structures, striking from angles Imperial forces had not anticipated. Administratum clerks catalogued them as war beasts, though Mechanicus analysis suggested highly advanced gyroscopic stabilization and adaptive programming. Whether these were purely mechanical or partially bioengineered remains unknown. The Imperium's first and only major war with the Interex thus became a rapid escalation of miscalculation. Horus himself is recorded as having attempted reconciliation after the artifact theft, but the Interex councils deemed Imperial aggression irreconcilable with their values of balance. In their eyes, the theft of a dangerous weapon, coupled with the Imperium's insistence on unilateral dominance, was sufficient evidence that Terra's empire represented a destabilizing threat. The resulting conflict was, therefore, not an attempt at conquest by the Interex, but a defensive war fought with precision and restraint. Despite their skill, the Interex could not withstand the scale of Imperial retaliation. Administratum battle summaries indicate that once the full weight of Astartes legions was deployed, the Interex defensive strategies began to falter. Their efficiency in limited engagements could not scale against the sheer attrition power of the Great Crusade. Mechanicus reconstructions hypothesize that, While Interex weapons were individually superior in some contexts, they lacked the industrial base to produce them in sufficient numbers to match Imperial output. Thus, despite inflicting severe early casualties, their forces were gradually ground down. The final battles of the Interex, though not described in complete detail, appear to have followed a pattern of defensive collapse. Administratum records describe city after city falling to sustained bombardment, followed by Astartes assaults. Civilians, who had previously been preserved through Interex restraint, were inevitably caught in the destruction. Reports suggest that the Interex councils were captured or annihilated during the final stages of conflict, though no definitive record survives of their end. Their war machines, once considered a hallmark of their fighting style, were destroyed or dismantled by Mechanicus forces seeking to purge Xenos contamination. The Administratum categorized the compliance as prolonged but successful, though it was noted as unusually costly for the scale of civilization involved. The Mechanicus sealed most of their evaluations, declaring the recovered technologies to be unsuitable for further study and consigning them to restricted vaults. This suggests that the true capabilities of Interex weaponry may have been deliberately concealed, either to avoid heretical temptation or to prevent knowledge of a rival human path from spreading. The battles against the Interex therefore remain important not for their military scale but for their philosophical weight. They represent one of the few recorded instances where the Imperium encountered a stable, advanced, and ethically distinct human society and chose eradication over assimilation. The Interex's fighting style, precise, restrained, technologically advanced yet ethically bound, was incompatible with the Imperium's doctrine of overwhelming force and unquestioned dominance. The war revealed both the strength of the Interex and the limits of their philosophy. For a society that refused to abandon its values in war could not match an empire that recognized no such restraints. What remains of these battles are scattered notes in Administratum logs and redacted Mechanicus transcripts. The Interex were not remembered for grand victories or conquests, but for the way their restrained doctrine left a lasting impression on those who recorded it. Their wars, brief and tragic, stand as evidence of both their discipline and their downfall. Surviving accounts of the conflict with the Interex are sparse and often contradictory. This is not unusual for engagements during the Great Crusade, as much of the official record was designed to reinforce the inevitability of Imperial victory rather than preserve the nuance of actual events. Yet a few fragments endure in Administratum repositories and Mechanicus redactions, first-hand testimonies from officers, remembrances, and support personnel who either survived the campaign or compiled their impressions shortly after the destruction of the Interex polity. One such testimony, attributed to an unnamed junior remembrancer travelling with the Lunar Wolves, described the first moments of battle in a manner more clinical than emotional. Their movements were unlike any I had seen. They did not surge forward, nor did they falter. They bent their formations as though in rehearsal, as if each man and woman had been told in advance where they must stand when death approached. Our shells fell among them, but they did not scatter. They adjusted. It was as if we were rehearsing our part in their play, not the other way around. Another report, believed to have been authored by a logistics officer attached to the expeditionary fleet, noted the effect of Interex precision on Imperial supply lines. Their strikes did not waste effort. They did not attack fortifications when it was easier to deny us fuel. They avoided lines of battle and appeared instead at the edges, cutting transport, striking against the Vox. It was not an attempt to defeat us in the field. It was an attempt to dissolve us before we arrived. This account was suppressed in later archives, though fragments remained in the Mechanicus data vaults. The implications were troubling, that the Interex had engaged not in reckless defense, but in strategic disruption, targeting the arteries of Imperial warfare. From the perspective of Imperial soldiery, the experience was deeply unsettling. One eyewitness, a surviving auxiliary officer, remarked that the Interex did not curse or shout during the melee. They killed in silence, not because they were voiceless, but because noise seemed beneath them. We screamed when we struck, they did not. It was as though their arrows and blades carried their voices for them. It made them seem less like men, and more like instruments being played by another hand. This perception reinforced within the ranks the impression that the Interex were unnaturally disciplined, or perhaps enhanced by forbidden means. Administratum scribes later described such testimony as morale impacting and relegated them to sealed files. Horus himself is reported to have attempted to salvage peace after the first clashes, though no direct transcript survives. Administratum summaries indicate that the War Master acknowledged both the strength and the principles of the Interex, but concluded that they would not bend. Their councils, described in earlier diplomatic records as both rational and restrained, refused Imperial offers of limited autonomy. From their perspective, the Imperium's theft of the Kinnebrack artifact and insistence on unilateral compliance proved that Terra's empire represented precisely the kind of destabilizing aggression they had built their society to resist. Thus, reconciliation collapsed into protracted war. The aftermath of this war was devastating not only for the Interex but for Imperial perception of what had been lost. Administratum records describe entire cities leveled by orbital fire. What remained was absorbed, burned, or buried. Surviving populations were either exterminated or forcibly dispersed into compliant labor pools. The Administratum concluded its assessment with the phrase, "compliance incomplete, records terminated." In bureaucratic terms, this phrasing implied that the population had been extinguished rather than integrated. The Mechanicus' perspective on the aftermath was equally grim but couched in technical terms. Their reports speak of vaults seized and immediately classified. The Kinnebrack artifacts, along with Interex weaponry and war machines, were catalogued and secured. Subsequent notations indicate that many of these artifacts were consigned to deep storage, sealed beneath Mars and on distant forges. The official reasoning was risk of contamination. The subtext, however, is clear. The technologies represented both a potential boon and a doctrinal threat. A civilization that had successfully integrated alien craft into human warfare without collapse represented an ideological danger. The safest course was to erase their record, not to preserve it. In reviewing the eyewitness accounts alongside the final evaluations, a stark contrast emerges. The remembrancers and soldiers describe the Interex with a mixture of awe and dread, emphasizing their harmony and motion, their silent precision, and their refusal to abandon restraint even in the face of annihilation. The Administratum reduces these descriptions into data points: population numbers, compliance status, threat ratings. The Mechanicus transforms them into sealed warnings, evidence of technological heresy. What was lived experience became bureaucratic summary, and in that conversion the Interex were effectively erased. The long-term aftermath reveals itself in how rarely the Interex are mentioned in subsequent Imperial chronicles. Administratum compilations of compliance campaigns list them briefly, without detail, as one more entry among thousands. In Mechanicus archives, their name is often omitted altogether, replaced with generic markers for Xenos-tainted human society. To later historians, the absence is almost as telling as the presence. It suggests a deliberate excision, a quiet consensus between Terra and Mars that the Interex represented not only a military opponent but a political embarrassment. For the Administratum, the Interex were evidence of a human civilization that had endured old night without the Emperor's guidance, maintaining stability, balance, and technological sophistication. To admit their existence in detail would undermine the narrative of imperial necessity. For the Mechanicus, they were a reminder that knowledge could be wielded responsibly outside the cult of the machine god, in partnership with alien influence no less. This was intolerable to their theology. Thus, both institutions converged on the same conclusion: silence. Final analysis documents that remain accessible today consistently repeat a small set of conclusions. First, that the Interex were militarily efficient but lacked the scale to resist imperial attrition. Second, that their ethical restraint was both their distinguishing strength and their fatal weakness, for they could not wage total war against an empire that recognized no limits. Third, that their integration of Xenos-derived weaponry placed them outside the bounds of acceptable humanity, regardless of their stability or restraint. One sealed Mechanicus annotation, partially declassified after the heresy, states, "It is believed that the Interex represented the closest approximation to a post-technological human equilibrium society discovered during the Crusade. Their extinction was not solely the result of aggression, but of incompatibility with the Imperium's foundational principles. The choice to terminate them may have been politically necessary, but from a techno-archaeological perspective it was the destruction of a unique anomaly." The Administratum's final verdict, by contrast, was unambiguous. Compliance achieved, culture unsuitable for integration, extinction confirmed. In bureaucratic prose, this was the closing of a file, nothing more. Yet when set beside the surviving testimonies of those who witnessed the Interex in battle, it reveals the gulf between lived memory and official history. To those who fought them, the Interex were a disciplined and formidable people. To the Imperium that destroyed them, they were a problem solved. The aftermath, therefore, is not simply the erasure of a civilization, it is the erasure of an alternative. In their councils, their weapons, their restraint and their balance, the Interex embodied a path humanity could have taken, one that did not require conquest, nor demand endless expansion, nor sanctify war. For the Imperium, such a path was intolerable, and so it was buried. What remains is silence, punctuated only by fragments of testimony and sealed Mechanicus warnings. The Administratum closed their files with formulaic precision. The Mechanicus sealed theirs with doctrinal caution. But for those who glimpsed the Interex firsthand, the memory lingered, of soldiers who fought without waste, of machines that moved like living beasts, of a civilization extinguished not because it failed, but because it did not conform. The Inquisition has long regarded the Interex as one of the most unusual encounters of the Great Crusade, not for the size of its holdings nor for the power of its war machines, but because it represented a civilization that contradicted nearly every assumption the Imperium held about humanity's fate among the stars. The surviving files, fragmentary and redacted, reflect the unease of agents who sifted through scattered administratum records, mechanicum transmissions, and scattered testimonies from those who studied the failed diplomacy between the two peoples. From these scraps, the Ordo Xenos and the Ordo Hereticus attempted to compile impressions, yet none of the resulting documents resolve the central paradox. The Interex was advanced, orderly, and, at least by surface measures, stable, but its defining features defied the universal patterns the Imperium believed immutable. The first impression, consistently noted in inquisitorial commentary, is the Interex's systemic fusion of human and Xenos society. For most branches of the Imperium, the idea that humanity could coexist with another intelligent species without subjugation or extinction was heretical. To the Interex, however, this integration was not only tolerated but enshrined in law and tradition. The Inquisition marked this as an unexplainable anomaly. In the long sweep of history, every imperial chart and compliance record points to the inevitability of xenophobic collapse, assimilation, or destruction whenever humans encountered an alien species of comparable sophistication. Yet the Interex apparently maintained a balanced confederation, with human and Xenos populations contributing equally to culture, economy, and governance. The Ordo Xenos judged this to be an unstable arrangement that should not have survived even a single millennium, much less the several thousands of years the Interex claimed for their shared society. The nature of this relationship remains poorly understood. The Inquisition found no reliable accounts of the Interex political apparatus beyond what was described by emissaries of the Great Crusade. Their system, referred to simply as the Council, was a collective of leaders drawn from both human and Xenos populations. It is not clear whether this body held supreme authority or acted as a representative chamber under another unseen authority. What remains certain is that the Interex delegation emphasized unity of interest, claiming that interspecies harmony was not accidental, but engineered through deliberate cultural shaping. This claim disturbed inquisitorial analysts, for it implied mastery over social engineering on a scale the Imperium rarely achieved. The Ordo Hereticus in particular expressed alarm at the possibility that the Interex had harnessed psychic or memetic technologies, to suppress the natural suspicion between species, although no material evidence confirms this. Further troubling to inquisitorial records was the Interex's command of technology and cultural memory. Their libraries, known as the Castorel repositories, were reputed to contain archives not only of their own past, but of civilizations long extinct. Imperial officers noted that these records were presented with clinical precision and breadth far beyond the scope of the Imperium's own holdings of the era. The Inquisition observed that such breadth of data might explain their apparent immunity to the patterns of collapse. If a civilization could accurately record the failures of others, it might inoculate itself against the same fate. Yet such reasoning led inquisitors into uncomfortable territory. For if knowledge alone could secure survival, then the Imperium's reliance on secrecy, censorship, and ignorance as tools of control might itself doom mankind. This implication was never stated directly in official files, but it lingers in private annotations, often heavily censored or destroyed. The role of the Interex military was another point of contradiction. Administratum and Mechanicum sources describe their armies as highly disciplined, equipped with advanced war gear, and supported by instruments the Imperium could scarcely comprehend. Among these were the Kith, living weapons bred for combat but bound by codes of behaviour that prevented their uncontrolled use. To the Interex, such war beasts were tools of defence, a deterrent rather than an instrument of conquest. Inquisitorial commentary repeatedly emphasises the strangeness of this restraint. Every major human polity known to the Imperium weaponized its advantages to secure dominance. That the Interex possessed weapons equal to or beyond the Imperium's, yet refrained from expansion, was seen as unnatural, even impossible. Some inquisitors suspected a hidden weakness, perhaps a resource scarcity or dependence on Xenos technology that limited their ambition. Others, more cautious, suggested that the Interex possessed a cultural maturity that rejected conquest as wasteful. Neither interpretation satisfied all parties, and neither can be verified. The most unexplainable impression left by the Interex lies in their relationship with chaos. The records recovered indicate that the Interex not only understood the existence of the warp's hostile entities, but had devised structured safeguards to contain and repel them. Their primary means of defense was the Cathara, a musical instrument engineered as a psychic warding device. Its sound disrupted warp-based incursions, functioning as both a warning and a weapon. For the Inquisition, this was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. Humanity and the Imperium had fought for millennia against the slow erosion of sanity and civilization caused by chaos, and yet here was a culture that openly acknowledged it, systematized its dangers, and embedded its rejection into daily life without secrecy or superstition. One inquisitorial observer wrote that the Interex lived alongside the warp as one might live near a river, understanding its floods and preparing walls against it, whereas the Imperium pretended the river did not exist, even as its waters swept away entire worlds. The Order Malleus, whose purpose is to monitor and destroy demonic threats, classified the Interex approach as both admirable and intolerable. Admirable because it proved that civilization could survive by recognizing and confronting chaos directly. Intolerable because such open acknowledgement undermined the secrecy that the Imperium enforced to maintain order. If word had spread that another human society had mastered a defensive relationship with the warp, the Imperium's claim to be the sole bulwark against demonic corruption would have been weakened. Some inquisitors feared this knowledge more than they feared the Interex themselves, which explains the intensity of redaction and erasure in later records. The issue of the Lunar Wolves' embassy and the theft of a Xenos blade later identified as a weapon of the Anatheme deepens these mysteries. The Inquisition remains divided on whether the theft was truly accidental, as some accounts claim, or whether it was manipulated by outside forces. The Interex treated the incident as proof that the Imperium was untrustworthy, and this sparked the collapse of negotiations. To the Inquisition, however, the more pressing question was why such a weapon was held in a museum accessible to outsiders. The Anatheme was known to the Interex as a relic of catastrophic danger, yet it was not hidden in a vault but displayed as part of their cultural history. This suggested a society that preserved even the most perilous of artifacts as a matter of principle. Such confidence was interpreted by inquisitors either as arrogance or as evidence that the Interex possessed containment methods the Imperium lacked. The matter was never resolved, and the destruction of the Interex following their war with the Lunar Wolves ensured no further inquiry could be made. Observations of Interex civilian life also left the Inquisition unsettled. Reports describe a society that was orderly, egalitarian, and free of the widespread poverty and ignorance common in the Imperium. While class divisions existed, they were not oppressive, and governance appeared to function through consensus rather than compulsion. The Inquisition recognized that such a system, if made known to imperial subjects, could inspire rebellion or reformist sentiment. Thus, the very existence of the Interex became a liability to imperial stability. Their survival demonstrated that mankind did not need the Emperor's dominion to thrive. This fact was perhaps the most dangerous unexplainable element of all, one that justified their erasure from records. Among the surviving notes of inquisitors who studied the Interex, one theme recurs: a sense of profound discomfort. The Interex challenged the inevitability of imperial doctrine. They were not a civilization of superstition or decay. They were not tyrants ruling through terror. They were not mutants or heretics surrendering to chaos. They were, by every measurable standard, successful. And it is this success that the Inquisition found most intolerable. For in their existence lay the possibility that the Imperium's path, endless war, suppression of knowledge, enforced ignorance, was not the only way. The Inquisition, tasked with defending the Imperium not only against external threats, but against internal doubt, could not permit such an idea to spread. Even so, gaps remain. The Inquisition could never fully explain how the Interex maintained its cohesion across thousands of years. They could not determine the limits of their military strength, nor the true extent of their archives. They could not explain how psychic instruments such as the Cathara functioned with such precision, or whether they represented a form of controlled sorcery. They could not explain why the Interex did not attempt expansion or conquest despite their evident strength. They could not resolve whether the Interex collapsed solely due to conflict with the Lunar Wolves, or whether internal stresses had already begun to erode them. Each of these unanswered questions contributes to the classification of the Interex as an anomaly within imperial historiography. Ultimately, the Inquisition recorded their impressions with the language of contradiction. The Interex were advanced yet vulnerable, peaceful yet heavily armed, egalitarian yet hierarchical, human yet alien. Each quality defied the dichotomies upon which the Imperium constructed its understanding of the galaxy. To some inquisitors, the Interex were proof that mankind could choose another path. To others, they were a dangerous mirage whose very existence undermined the foundation of imperial truth. The unresolved tension remains evident in the surviving files, where annotations shift between admiration, suspicion, and condemnation, sometimes within the same passage. The final impression left to the Inquisition was one of silence. The Interex were destroyed, their libraries burned, their cities emptied, their mixed populations scattered or exterminated. The possibility they represented was erased. And yet the very act of erasure has left a deeper unease, for the memory persists in hidden archives such as these. The Interex cannot be unremembered, and in their absence, the unexplainable qualities grow sharper. Their coexistence with Xenos, their measured mastery of the warp, their restraint in war, and their preservation of dangerous relics remain paradoxes the Imperium cannot reconcile. And so the Interex endure not as a living society, but as an unanswered question, one that troubles the Inquisition still. The Inquisition's sealed archives contain scattered accounts of the Interex during times of war. While the official imperial record reduces them to a footnote of the Great Crusade, deeper review shows fragments of conflicts, anomalies, and engagements that refuse easy explanation. These fragments survive in Mechanicum signal intercepts, transcribed administratum reports, and in heavily redacted files within the Ordo Xenos. Together, they present a picture of the Interex not as a minor peripheral civilization, but as a martial culture with distinct methods that continue to perplex Imperial analysts. The most immediate anomaly was the conflict that ended Imperial contact with the Interex. According to the surface-level account, relations collapsed following the theft of an artifact from the Interex museum, leading to hostilities with the Lunar Wolves. Yet, in sealed inquisitorial files, the narrative is not so straightforward. Multiple observers noted that the Interex responded to the incident with a level of coordination that implied they had been prepared for confrontation long before the theft occurred. Their cities moved into martial lockdown within hours, civilian populations evacuated or shielded with a precision and efficiency the Imperium rarely achieved. The Interex military deployed units that were not previously observed by Imperial reconnaissance, suggesting that their war machine was concealed during the earlier stages of contact. This concealment itself was troubling. The Imperium, by design, projects its military strength openly. Compliance is achieved by demonstration of overwhelming force. The Interex, however, revealed strength only when provoked, and when it appeared, it was measured rather than absolute. Inquisitorial commentary flagged this as a cultural anomaly. It suggested that the Interex had mastered the art of deterrence without reliance on constant intimidation. They were confident in their power, but saw no need to display it until necessary. To the Imperium, this was alien, even when practiced by humans. The battle that ensued between the Lunar Wolves and the Interex is described inconsistently in Imperial records. Some accounts suggest a straightforward engagement, with the Space Marines assaulting Interex positions and overwhelming them. But sealed reports within the Ordo Xenos describe the encounter differently. They speak of Interex defences that did not align with any known tactical doctrines. Defensive structures activated with harmonic resonance, disabling or disorienting advancing troops. Infantry units were supported by Kith war beasts, whose presence caused fear responses even in gene-enhanced Space Marines, a reaction documented as highly irregular. The Kith are described as more than biological constructs. They appeared to possess semi-psychic deterrent abilities, an impression consistent with the Interex's broader use of harmonic and psychic countermeasures. More troubling were the accounts of the anatheme itself. Once the weapon was removed from Interex custody, the tide of conflict shifted in ways that defy conventional explanation. Inquisitorial scribes noted that the Interex seemed to fight not only against the Lunar Wolves, but against some unseen contagion unleashed by the loss of the blade. Units that had previously fought in disciplined formation began to fracture. Command structures dissolved in places without visible cause. Some suggest the anatheme projected influence once removed from containment, destabilizing the Interex through subtle psychic or mimetic infection. This theory remains speculative, but its persistence in sealed commentary underscores the suspicion that the artifact was more than a simple blade. Beyond this single engagement, other reports hint at prior conflicts involving the Interex. These are fragmentary, often referenced obliquely in their own records, and survive now only in partial translation. One such record speaks of the War of the Scythes, a confrontation with a Xenos power whose identity remains unclear. The record describes battles fought not with mass bombardments, but with duels between champions whose victories dictated the movement of entire armies. The Inquisition regards this as anomalous, since such a form of ritualized combat rarely survives in cultures of advanced technology. Yet the Interex appear to have preserved it, embedding ritual contest into their military conduct. Some inquisitors interpret this as a vestige of ancient tradition. Others view it as evidence of a society that intentionally limited escalation to preserve stability. Another anomalous report concerns the Interex use of environmental warfare. One fragment describes a campaign on a desert world in which Interex forces altered local atmospheric conditions to suppress enemy movement. The exact mechanism is unclear. Some descriptions suggest harmonic devices capable of manipulating wind and temperature, while others imply controlled biological agents that adjusted the ecosystem. What is notable is that these methods were defensive, designed to deny terrain rather than obliterate it. This restraint was flagged by inquisitorial analysts as deeply inconsistent with common human practice, where overwhelming force is the norm. The restraint raised the possibility that the Interex valued preservation of worlds even in war, a cultural anomaly that remains unexplained. Sealed Mechanicum reports also reference anomalies in Interex starship design. Unlike Imperial warships, which rely on heavy armor, void shields, and brute firepower, Interex vessels were described as agile and unusually silent. Vox interference was minimal, and Auspex reading suggested layered defenses tuned to frequencies that disrupted warp-based interference. Some Mechanicum adepts recorded unusual energy signatures around Interex capital ships that could not be reconciled with conventional shielding. These anomalies, though never fully documented, raised the possibility that Interex fleets employed defensive systems tuned not merely to physical weaponry, but to psychic intrusion. If true, this would mark them as one of the few known human polities to deliberately weaponize psychic harmonics at fleet scale. The Ordo Malleus sealed such records on the grounds that even speculation of such technologies could inspire dangerous research within the Imperium. The aftermath of battles involving the Interex further deepened the anomaly. In sealed witness reports, Interex forces are described as prioritizing recovery of their dead above all else. They retrieved not only human casualties, but Xenos allies, and even the remains of enemy combatants. This practice baffled Imperial observers. To the Imperium, battlefield dead are often abandoned or destroyed to prevent contamination. For the Interex, the dead were retrieved with solemn urgency, sometimes at the cost of tactical advantage. One interpretation suggests that they feared enemy exploitation of genetic material or spiritual corruption. Another theory, unconfirmed, posits that the Interex viewed the dead as essential to their cultural memory, and thus their retrieval was a means of preserving collective identity. The sealed archives also note that the Interex never deployed exterminator-scale weapons, even when strategically advantageous. Imperial officers during the Lunar Wolves conflict noted that worlds could have been scoured, yet the Interex refrained. This restraint, combined with their methods of precision warfare, struck the Inquisition as anomalous and dangerous. It implied not weakness, but principle, a principle that stood in direct opposition to Imperial doctrine. The Imperium enforces compliance by annihilation when necessary. The Interex rejected annihilation even when it might have secured victory. A final category of sealed reports concerns rumours of encounters between the Interex and the ruinous powers. Some accounts describe small-scale demonic incursions against Interex colonies, repelled not with mass purges but with psychic harmonics and disciplined collective ritual. These encounters are fragmentary and unverifiable, but they remain troubling to the Ordo Malleus. If true, they would mean that the Interex had fought demonic incursions successfully without the secrecy, censorship, and ritualized terror upon which the Imperium relies. The prospect that such engagements were recorded publicly within their society remains the most anomalous element of all. It represented a model of survival against chaos entirely alien to the Imperium's doctrine of suppression. Taken together, these anomalies, restraint in war, concealment of true military capacity, ritual combat traditions, environmental warfare, anomalous fleet defenses, prioritization of the dead, refusal of annihilation, and possible direct containment of chaos, create a picture that refuses to conform to Imperial categories. The Inquisition sealed these reports not only because they described unorthodox practices, but because they implied that the Interex were not simply another compliance target. They were a civilization whose differences suggested alternatives to the Imperium's way of war. The sealed commentary often circles back to one question. Were the Interex destroyed because they posed a military threat, or because they posed an ideological one? The anomalies in their conduct suggest the latter. They demonstrated that war could be restrained, that knowledge could be preserved openly, that chaos could be confronted without fear. To acknowledge such possibilities was intolerable to the Imperium. Thus the anomalies remain buried, marked as dangerous knowledge, preserved only in restricted archives of the Inquisition. The classified files concerning the Interex are among the most heavily redacted materials in inquisitorial possession. Unlike many archives where redactions hide names or locations, the documents here are marked by entire passages struck out. with marginal notes ordering their suppression. What remains paints the Interex not merely as a cultural anomaly, but as an existential threat to the structure of the Imperium's self-image. Their destruction by the Lunar Wolves closed one chapter, but for the Inquisition, the matter was never settled. The surviving reports reveal unease, speculation, and final thoughts that continue to trouble the Ordos to this day. The first classified files are marked under Ordo Xenos designation XN1734, originating from reviews conducted in the 2nd century of the 41st millennium. These files compile early impressions gathered after the rediscovery of the records of the Great Crusade. The investigators concluded that the Interex could not be considered a conventional Xenos polity, nor a human empire. Instead, they were categorized as hybridized anomalous, a classification rarely applied. The report emphasized the integration of human and alien species into a single polity, and noted that no reliable model exists within Imperial doctrine to predict how such integration develops or collapses. The conclusion of the file states, the Interex stand as a direct contradiction to Imperial law, not because of military defiance, but because their survival, if proven to be sustainable, would render our separationist policies arbitrary. The page ends with a notation that this line was ordered excised from all but the most restricted copies. Another series of classified files sealed under Ordo Malleus reference Mal 2431 concern the Interex relationship with chaos. These files review evidence of the Cathara instruments and their use as psychic wards. Transcripts describe their functioning in technical detail, noting harmonic resonances that could destabilize demonic manifestations. One entry reports that an intercepted fragment suggested the Interex used these instruments not only in war but in civilian ritual. Inquisitorial analysts judged this to be the most dangerous detail of all, that an entire culture openly accepted chaos as a reality, structured daily life around preventing it, and normalized anti-demonic countermeasures without secrecy or fear. The file concludes with an extraordinary note from a presiding inquisitor. If mankind can live openly with the warp and endure, then our policy of suppression is not necessity but choice. The Emperor's divinity would be reduced to interpretation, not fact. This comment is circled in red ink and marked for total erasure. Only faint traces of it survive in the archive, suggesting even within the Ordo Malleus such thoughts were considered intolerable. The most disturbing classified file bears the mark of the Ordo Hereticus, HER, 9980, and is referenced only in whispers among archivists. This file concerns the anatheme recovered during the Lunar Wolves' visit. The record suggests the blade was known to the Interex not merely as a weapon, but as a phenomenon that could bind history. Inquisitorial commentary describes the weapon as capable of altering outcomes by embedding itself into the causal chain of conflict. One fragment, badly damaged, notes, "It is believed the anatheme does not slay merely the body but alters the destiny of those who wield it and those struck by it." The file closes with the unexplained note that the theft of the blade may not have been accidental at all, but the intended result of manipulation by entities beyond either the Imperium or the Interex. That suggestion is followed by 3 pages of redaction. Further classified reviews evaluate the military potential of the Interex in terms forbidden for dissemination. These assessments concluded that the Interex could not have been defeated easily, if not for the accident of the anatheme's theft and the chaos it provoked. Estimates suggest that in open warfare, without such destabilizing incidents, the Interex might have resisted the Lunar Wolves for decades, and in certain circumstances might have inflicted significant casualties. While the Imperium ultimately overwhelmed them, the suggestion that a single human Xenos polity could contest even one Space Marine Legion was considered a psychological threat. Thus, these evaluations were sealed to prevent undermining the perception of inevitable Imperial dominance. The final section of the classified files concerns philosophical analysis, an unusual inclusion for inquisitorial archives. A handful of inquisitors, whose names are erased, posed questions not about the Interex's strength, but about their meaning. They asked whether the Imperium's destruction of the Interex represented a necessary act of survival, or an act of fear. They questioned whether humanity's future was best served by suppression of difference or by study of alternate models. These questions were suppressed immediately, labelled as heretical, yet they persist in shadowed copies. It is clear from the marginal notes that some inquisitors did not seek to glorify the Interex, but to understand what their existence implied. The very fact that such questions were asked is telling, for it reveals that even within the Inquisition, the Interex remained an unresolved problem. In reviewing the final thoughts preserved in these files, one impression dominates. The Interex were destroyed not simply because they could not be brought into compliance, but because their existence raised the possibility that the Imperium's path was not inevitable. This possibility is more dangerous than any army, any weapon, or any demonic incursion. If humanity could see that another human society had thrived without worship of the Emperor, without censorship of knowledge, without extermination of Xenos, and without denial of the warp, then the justification for the Imperium's methods would be fatally weakened. Thus, the final verdict of the Inquisition was that the Interex could not be allowed to exist, even in memory. Their eradication was not only a military act, but an epistemic one, the destruction of an idea. And yet, even in erasure, the Interex linger. The files that survive, though redacted, continue to trouble Imperial historians and Inquisitors alike. Their anomalies refuse to vanish. Their contradictions persist. Each rediscovery of their records forces a renewed effort of suppression, a cycle that repeats every few centuries as fragments re-emerge. The final thought recorded in these classified documents, though itself heavily censored, remains visible enough to read, "We destroyed them, but we did not destroy the question they posed." That question endures, and it may be that in time, others will find the same answer they did,